Hi everyone, we are going to get started in just a moment. I just am seeing more people join, so I'm going to pause for a second, let everyone join the Zoom. So thank you for your patience. Okay, I'm going to get started. It looks like people are still coming in, but good evening, hello, and welcome to Oregon Natural Desert Association's second event of our 2026 High Desert Speaker Series. This is Forged in Fire, the volcanic activity that shaped Oregon's high desert. My name is Claire Sekander. I am ONDA's Donor Relations Manager, and I'm your host tonight. Before we get started, if you have any technology questions, you can put those in the chat at the bottom of your screen. My colleague Karina Diaz is behind the scenes and she will help you out. If you have any questions for tonight's speaker, you can put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll have some time at the end of the event for an audience Q&A. And feel free to drop questions in as they come up throughout the presentation. No need to hold back until the very end. This event and the entire 2026 High Desert Speaker Series features a raffle with a pretty incredible prize package. There's gear and gift certificates from Andina Restaurant in Portland. We've got gear from Patagonia and Mir and Portland Leather Company and more. And you can purchase raffle tickets when registering for any Speaker Series event. You can do that on our website, onda.org/speaker series. Yes, it's in the chat. Thank you. And we're halfway through the speaker series, so go check out the other events. We have an in-person Portland event on February 26th, all about high desert trees. And we have another online free event on March 11 about tribal history and culture. I want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors. Thank you to WildWorks and First Interstate Bank for supporting high desert conservation and the entire speaker series, including tonight's event. And now a little bit about Oregon Natural Desert Association, also known as ONDA. We exist because we believe Oregon's high desert lands, waters, and wildlife need a voice for their protection. ONDA is a leader in conservation throughout the West and especially across more than 12 million acres of public land in Eastern Oregon. We helped create the first and only 3 desert wilderness areas in Oregon. We've expanded wild and scenic river designations, and our on-the-ground habitat restoration projects ensure that the high desert remains healthy and vibrant. This year, our focus includes defending existing conservation protections and expanding grassroots community-led advocacy to support our conservation goals. ONDA is the conservation organization getting the work done to protect the high desert, and we hope that you choose to support conservation by making a donation and becoming a member tonight. Our suggested donation is $40, but a donation of any amount allows you to become an ONDA member. And if you are already a member, thank you so much. We really appreciate your support, and please consider making a special donation tonight. I see, yes, excellent. Karina put the donate link in the chat. Thank you so much. Okay, and with that, let's get this event started. I'm excited to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Ellen Bishop. Dr. Bishop, you can join me on screen and turn your camera on. There you go. Hello, Dr. Bishop is a accomplished geologist, author, and Eastern Oregon resident. She has written multiple books about ecology, geology, and hiking in Oregon. And her newest book, Living with Thunder, which touches on topics in tonight's presentation, is out now, and I encourage you to check it out. So with that, Dr. Bishop, I will hand it over to you to dive in and talk about how the volcanic activity shaped Oregon's high desert.
All right, thank you very, very much. I appreciate the introduction and I look forward to this presentation and hope you find it interesting and very, very informative. Now, if I can just share my screen here. Let's bring this up and I'll get rid of that. Come on, go away. There we go. All right, so I'm going to talk about tonight about the Yellowstone hotspot, which indeed is a um, a huge part of the high desert geology, and it's basically something that is right on the cutting edge of understanding the geology of the high desert now. So there we go. All right, so with that, let's get started. Let's kind of dive right into how the Yellowstone hotspot forged the high desert landscape. Well, what is a hotspot to begin with? I mean, this is some,
Helen,
yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I cannot see your screens if you are sharing them.
really. Okay, well, let me do the share screen thing again, and let me try this.
Okay.
How are we doing?
We're doing great.
Okay, great.
I can see
So,
it. Okay, go ahead.
awesome. All right. So now let me hit slideshow here. Do, 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 do. Okay, so how does that work? So can you see the whole screen now?
That looks great.
Okay,
And perhaps turn off the subtitles because I know Zoom has its own subtitles. Yeah,
I
there you
just
go.
did.
Okay.
All right, great. We can now launch. Super. Thank you. So basically, the Yellowstone hotspot, most of us think of as just being a giant volcano in Wyoming that erupted about 600,000 years ago, roughly. But as geology has learned more about Yellowstone and more about hotspots, we have discovered that it's not really this kind of a hotspot. When geologists talk about a hotspot, we're talking about something like the Cobb Seamount on the Juan de Fuca Ridge that basically, erupts not only hot water but also is a very active volcano. And of course, here's Yellowstone. But let's take a look at what a geologic hotspot is, because that's really important to understanding how the Yellowstone hotspot crafted actually the vast majority of volcanic rocks in Oregon. So a hotspot is a location that actually stays still. It is rooted in the upper mantle, about 1,700 miles beneath us. And it's a plume of magma and heat that rises to the surface from the lower mantle of the Earth. As you can see on this map, basically it includes Hawaii, it includes Yellowstone and the Cobb hotspot, but many, many others around the globe, Easter Island, the Galapagos, um, Pitcairn Islands. Samoa is a hotspot, probably in several ways. So there's not just one or two hotspots, there are many around the globe. Many of these plumes that rise from the mantle, they're stationary and the plates move across them. So let's take a look at how Hawaii operates as a typical geologic hotspot, or what we call a mantle plume in geology. The mantle plume today is beneath the Big Island, and it basically produces Mauna Loa, Kilauea, and Owyhee Seamount that's off the coast of Hawaii. The Pacific Plate is moving towards the left of your screen, and as that plate moves over the hotspot erupts, and then the plate moves further. And if you can see me here on the upper right of your screen, if you put your sort of do the hotspot salute and hold your hand out flat and then put a finger underneath that, if your finger is the hotspot, the plate moves across the hotspot. And so what the material that erupts from the hotspot appears here to move but actually it's the plate above it that's moving. So in Hawaii, in the island chain, Hawaii is the youngest, Maui is the next youngest, Molokai, Oahu, 3.4 million years old, Kauai, 4.9 million years old, and so forth. So the hotspot stays stationary, the plate moves across the top of it. Here's another view of Hawaii. So you can see the direction of the plate motion and how the plate actually just carries the erupted volcanoes away from the hotspot. So they get progressively older away from the hotspot. If you look at the map, the global map down here in the bottom left-hand side, you'll see there's Hawaii and there's a whole chain of volcanoes. And then the Pacific plate changed its motion at about 60 million years ago. And so we have a whole chain of volcanoes called the Emperor Seamount chain that's disappearing under the Kamchatka Peninsula. So these are volcanoes here that were here when the dinosaurs were wandering around 100 million years ago. So a hotspot can last for a very long time. They're not ephemeral features. We have here a hotspot known as Hawaii, or known, I'm sorry, known as the Owyhees, and many other locations. And so in the upper left-hand side, I think part of my slide is kind of obscured by some of the videos here, but the thing to look at in this slide is that the Yellowstone hotspot, as it erupts through the continent, produces two different kinds of eruptive products. So this is basically in the Owyhees, and you see that there's light-colored material that's mostly volcanic tuff, that's rhyolite, and it has a very silica-rich composition. And then above that, there are two layers of basalt, and also in the foreground you can see basalt. So the hotspot magma itself is a hot material that is very basaltic. It's very much like a basalt. It's iron rich and very fluid. When it encounters the continent, it's hotter than the continental melting point, and so it melts part of the continent and produces rhyolite that then erupts as these big rhyolite volcanoes called calderas. So if you have questions about this, just stick them in the question box, and I'll be happy to address them. So this very complicated looking slide kind of shows how a continental hotspot like Yellowstone works. You have the hotspot rising up into the mantle, and as it rises into the mantle, it produces not only the melt that it brings with us, but it also melts some of the mantle, and therefore it produces the red material that is known as a basalt magma that will erupt basalt. But the basalt and the hotspot also melt part of the continent, and that material is much more silica rich, and it often produces a very explosive eruption that contains a lot of volcanic ash and a silica-rich, light-colored rock called rhyolite. You'll see lots of rhyolites as we go through the talk tonight. So that means that these are bimodal. They produce dark material called basalt, iron-rich material, and light-colored volcanic ash and light-colored rhyolites. A bimodal kind of material. One of the ways that, if we go back to this, we go back to the slide previous to this, if I can manage to get us, there we go. You can see that there's a very explosive eruption, often related to the Yellowstone hotspot. And so I'm just going to go through what that explosive eruption is like. It's this is a volcanic caldera, and rather than producing a gigantic volcano that looks like Mount Hood. A caldera produces a very, very flat volcano that has kind of a hole in it. So if you drive up to Yellowstone itself today, you don't drive into Yellowstone National Park and say, wow, look at that really huge volcano. You go to Yellowstone Lake, and that's the depression in the middle of the of this giant 40-mile wide eruptive center that is the Yellowstone caldera. So let's see how this happens. We get a lot of, of magma, the red stuff, fluid rock. Sometimes it's basaltic, sometimes it's a rhyolite that's coming up into the crust. It domes up the crust. It begins to push out some lava, as you can see and lots of steam and geysers and other things along the edges where it kind of cracks the earth open in a big round feature. That basically leads to um, additional cracking of the uplifted crust above this magma chamber, and the blue is water and other gases that really are very common and abundant in rhyolites. They can't move without water. And then basically the pressure of the magma will crack and break that crust. That unleashes the beginning of a huge eruption with lots and lots of ash coming out here, and also something called an ignimbrite, which is a very hot flow that contains molten ash. That's part of which did in Pompeii. And then we see this huge eruption that occurs as the caldera blows its lid, so to speak, and can send ash and hot material for hundreds of miles in all directions, or in the case of Yellowstone, dominantly to the north um, and east. Then the volcano can actually, it quiets down, it thinks a little bit, the magma begins to solidify, and then the leftover magma can re-erupt into what's called the resurgent dome, which, as you'll see, is an important feature in particular of the Crooked River caldera near Prineville. And it also leaves behind a lot of really thick ash deposits. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about Yellowstone. Our understanding of Yellowstone has been a long time in coming. Yellowstone was first mapped in 1871, and then in 1878, William Holmes of the U.S. Geological Survey did a much more thorough mapping job. A quote from him is, quote, "Geologists have glanced at the surface, but more profound and intricate problems remain untouched." And he was absolutely correct. I also ought to mention that in 1805, a letter went from the superintendent of, not of Yellowstone National Park, but of the governor of Louisiana Territory to Thomas Jefferson, because he had witnessed a drawing of a map, actually, of Yellowstone, what we call Yellowstone National Park today, drawn by indigenous peoples, and the tribe is obscure, but it could have been anyone from the Shoshone to the Blackfeet to the Nez Perce. That was a drawing showing that Yellowstone was a volcano. So it's a part of our indigenous history. It wasn't until the 1950s and 60s that Yellowstone was understood as a caldera. And it wasn't really until the 1970s that we understood that there was an age progression. And I'm going to talk about the age progression here in just a second. So you can see here on this map of the Snake River Plain and what's called the Yellowstone Volcanic Trend, that the red rocks here are basalt. The cream colored rocks that are kind of hard to distinguish are rhyolites. And they go along a very nice, simple trend. Well, the McDermott caldera that we're going to talk about more later in this talk um, was thought to begin this trend. And in the 1980s, in particular, the idea was that the McDermott caldera was where the Yellowstone hotspot first came to the surface and first erupted. That was thought to be at 14 million years, but better dating now puts it at about 16.4 million years. And then as we go along here, we see I've highlighted these that the Bruno Jarbidge caldera is 12 to 10 million years old. The Twin Falls is 11 to 9. So these get younger as you get closer and closer to Yellowstone. Peekaboo, here's Pocatello down here. The Highs series of calderas, and finally Yellowstone, which erupted from about 2.1 million years to about zero point 0.6 million years ago. So there's a clear age progression from the west to the east of volcanoes getting younger. And so you can think this is kind of like Hawaii, where the hotspot is here and the uh, plate has moved over it in an east to west moving direction. And that's why you have this age progression. But this is what we know comprises the Yellowstone hotspots volcanic production now. And I'll show you a slide in a second that actually shows what this progression is like. But first, I want to credit many of the geologists who've worked on this, particularly Bob Duncan and Emily Cahoon at OSU, Martin Streck and others at Portland State, Vic Camp at San Diego State University, Mark Ferns and Jason McClarty of Dogami, and Doug Pyle at the University of Hawaii, and Gail Mayhood and her student Thomas Benson at Stanford, and a lot of other people have worked on this. But this concept is about 5 to 10 years old in terms of understanding that all of these volcanics of the high desert are related to the Yellowstone hotspot. So let me show how this very complex, very geographically widespread series of eruptions began. It started basically in the Coast Range when a volcanic plateau and series of seamounts that were active at the time collided with North America. That produced basically the Coast Range of Oregon, the Coast Range of Washington, and the Olympic Peninsula. Many of the rocks in the Olympic Mountains are part of this very, very large oceanic plateau. The next eruptions we see are around Prineville in what we now know as the John Day Formation. They include rocks at Prineville, the Crooked River caldera, Smith Rock in particular, another caldera, and then Tower Mountain over here by LeGrand. Then we see the beginning of the Columbia River basalts. And then we see more of the Columbia River basalts, particularly the Steens basalts and ultimately the Grand Ronde basalts. So these cover Washington, much of Oregon, southeast Oregon, and the McDermott caldera is a contemporary of the Steens basalts. Then we see the eruption basically of the Strawberry volcanics in the Strawberry Mountains and the Owyees and a number of other calderas that are just slightly younger to the same age as McDermott. That's followed by more Columbia River basalts, again, related to the Yellowstone hotspot. And then we have many other eruptions, including Dooley Mountain near Baker, Powder River volcanics, Oh, come on, we can do this. More Columbia River basalts. And finally, you can see that eruptions are occurring actually across the Snake River Plain at the same time that we're having eruptions, Yellowstone hotspot related eruptions far to the north. And we have a couple of varying explanations for how this happened. But nevertheless, if you look at the chemistry of these rocks, they all point to the Yellowstone hotspot. Okay, so how did this happen? Let's sort of go through um, the beginning of this. Here's the oceanic plateau known as Silesia. Here's North America moving to the west. Silesia is being carried by the Farallon Plate, and that's moving to the east, and it's going to collide with North America, and we're going to end up with pillow lavas that make up much of the Coast Range. If you go to Mary's Peak, for example, that's one of the places. I know that's not the high desert, but bear with me, guys. But nevertheless, these are pillow lavas, and pillow lavas erupt underwater. So this is part of a seamount that collided with the coast when the coast was somewhere around the eastern edge of the Willamette Valley. You can go to Elk Island outside of Portland and also find parts of the Silesia seamounts. So another pillow basalt in the Coast Range. And there were some eruptions of these rocks because it's an active hotspot. And so North America comes sliding across that hotspot, shutting it off for a while. But some of what we see as material basalts erupted by this hotspot, by the Yellowstone hotspot on the coast of Oregon, as Oregon began to slide across the hotspot, include Cape Perpetua, the Ahats basalts, and much of the volcanic rocks in the Tillamook's. All right, now let's go to something that begins to approach the high desert. That's Smith Rock and the Crooked River caldera. So we're going to look at Smith Rock in particular. And what's happening here is that we have this mantle hotspot that's coming up from the mantle. North America has moved to the west. The hotspot's still in the same place, but it also has to break through an old downgoing Farallon plate. And that basically, we think, may have changed the direction of its upward movement. It may actually have contributed to the Western Cascades, but in particular, it produced the Crooked River caldera, the Wildcat Mountain caldera, and the Tower Mountain caldera. If we look at the chemistry of the rocks, they tell us that there's a hotspot involved here. They're high in titanium, their helium isotopes and strontium isotopes are mantle derived. So the hotspot is definitely the cause of Smith Rock. So you don't have to go all the way to Yellowstone National Park to be at Yellowstone. You can just go to Smith Rock. And so here are a couple of rhyolite dikes that come up through Smith Rock. These are contributors to the final eruption of the caldera that produced all of the tuff of Smith Rock. And here's a map of the Crooked River caldera made by Mark Ferns and Jason McClarty about 12 years ago, maybe a little longer than that now. But at any rate, it's a caldera that's the same size or maybe a little smaller than Yellowstone. It includes Powell Buttes. It includes Grizzly Mountain, which is a big rhyolite dome. Gray Butte, also a big rhyolite dome. Smith Rock shows you a lot of the tuffs that erupted from this huge volcano. So if you can think back to the cross sections of the caldera that I showed, the Crooked River caldera erupted a huge plume of ash and gas. And then later on, there was the resurgent dome. The resurgent dome created Barnes Butte, and Barnes Butte was mined for mercury. It has a lot of uranium in it. It's enriched in a lot of things that these called large ion lithophile elements that uh, are found in these resurgent domes and also in some of the ash from these calderas and in the magmas themselves. So if we want to find out a little more about this, this is a rhyolite that erupted at Juniper Butte, which is north of Smith Rocks on your way to Madras. And rhyolites tend to be these very, very thick, gooey lavas that have sort of folds and contortions in them. So they're called banded rhyolites. But there are rhyolites like this on Grizzly Mountain. You can find them at Powell Buttes. So this erupted about 29 to 30 million years ago. And there are other calderas in the same area, rhyolites and tuffs, all the way from Ashwood to the Mutton Mountains, that suggest eruptions of calderas about the same time, between 40 and 25 million years old. They're considered part of what's called the John Day Formation. Um, Here's my old dog being really puzzled about why there are so many holes in the rock. Um, and I once was approached by a woman who was really concerned about some of the holes in the rocks in her backyard because her 3-year-old son had decided that these were all made by rockworms, and that rockworms were pretty vicious. But instead, they're actually made mostly by water. Um, and these are very explosive eruptions, largely driven by steam. So these are columnar andesite or columnar rhyolites near Ashwood over on the upper right. So there's more than one caldera and more than one gigantic eruption in this area. It just has not yet been mapped as well as it might be. So when I was a graduate student, we would go off to the Painted Hills. We would also go to Smith Rock and look at Smith Rock, and my esteemed professor would explain how Smith Rock was one little tiny eruption, and the in Powell Butte was another tiny little eruption, and this is in the 1980s, and so there was no clue about the idea that Smith Rock was part of a gigantic caldera eruption on the scale of Yellowstone. So where did all that ash go? Well, when we would go to the Painted Hills in the 1980s as a graduate student, um, Ed Taylor would talk about how all this ash came from the Western Cascades, and we would think and ask questions about, well, how could all this ash travel that far? And he would kind of say, well, it must have traveled that far because that's where the only place it could have erupted from. Again, in the 1980s, we had no idea about the scale of Yellowstone. But the ash from the that's now in the Painted Hills is largely a product of the Yellowstone hotspot eruptions that were farther to the west, that would include Smith Rocks and the Crooked River Caldera, the Wildcat Mountain Caldera, and a number of other calderas as yet unmapped, but we know they're there. Here's a good example of how we know that much of the Painted Hills came from the Crooked River Caldera. So this is the orange arrow is pointing at Carroll Rim, which is up at the top here. And if you analyze the top of Carroll Rim, it's a very hot ash flow tuff. And its composition and age matches that of Smith Rock. So it's pretty clear that this came from the Crooked River Caldera, And as we begin to analyze some of the other ash in here and other ignimbrites in here, it's pretty clear that they have a very similar origin. So perhaps not all of the Painted Hills came as ash erupted from the Crooked River caldera, certainly, but from other calderas to the west, whether they're Western Cascades related to the passage of the plate over the Yellowstone hotspot or another source. Here's a basaltic dike, an alkalic dike that matches the composition of seamounts in the Painted Hills themselves. So let's move the plate a little farther to the west. And the Yellowstone hotspot is now going to be beneath Steens Mountain. And if we track it and calculate where it would be right about where Steens Mountain is, maybe a little bit farther to the west. And Steens Mountain is about 17 million years old. The light-colored ash here, and ash and rhyolites, are part of the Pike Creek volcanics. And they, again, are an isotopic match to the Yellowstone hotspot. So these are here's another picture of Pike Creek volcanics, the sort of lighter red rocks. They're found beneath Steens Mountain, to the south of Steens Mountain, between Steens and the Pueblos. The Pueblo basalts are also part of the Steens basalts. But at any rate, so these are the precursors. These are rhyolites created as the hotspot moves, the continent moves to the west, and now this Steens Mountain is essentially over where the Yellowstone hotspot is. The hotspot has to melt its way through the crust in order to produce those basalts, and as it does that, it's going to melt the crust and create rhyolite magmas. So we have these Pike Creek volcanics and other volcanics that you'll find underneath Abert Rim, as well as down here at Steens, and also Winter Rim. So I'm going to show this slide to merely note, this will be on the final quiz, by the way. So this basically just shows that there are a lot of what are now recognized as the Columbia River rhyolites that erupted at the same time that all of the Columbia River basalts erupted. So the basalts and all of their names are on the left-hand side, the rhyolites are on the right-hand side. So it's a very, very long-term eruption of these rhyolites, Powder River volcanics, the Strawberry Mountains, again, all of which are related to the Yellowstone hotspot. So the Steens basalts, once the hotspot had worked its way through the crust and was able to actually erupt its basalts at the surface, were the first really truly voluminous eruptions of the Yellowstone hotspot. And this map basically shows down at the bottom, you can see if I can get my mouse to cooperate here. Here we go. Okay, so if you can see my mouse here, you'll note that the Steens basalts cover a tremendous area. They were once considered separate from the Columbia River basalts. Now they're part of the Columbia River basalts. They run from the Snake River and the Malheur River south across southeastern Oregon and down into Nevada and Northern California. They are very, very thick, and they obviously are named after Steens Mountain. Their compositions, again, bear the isotopic and trace element traces of the Yellowstone hotspot. So what I've shown on this slide is a number of eruptions that are related to the Columbia River basalts. And those include the basalts in Washington, all the basalts down here, and the basalts that run all the way to the coast. Now, the Columbia River basalts erupted from basically four different locations. The Chief Joseph Dyke Swarm, shown on the upper right, is the dominant area that most of the Columbia River basalts, about 90% of the Columbia River basalts, actually erupted from the Chief Joseph Dyke Swarm. The Monument Dyke Swarm, kind of on the northern fringe of what we might consider the high desert, but still kind of in the Blue Mountains, um, produced some of the oldest basalts. You can witness this. You can witness the monument basalts when you drive through Picture Gorge. Here's Highway 26. The Steens Dike Swarm is another large dike swarm, and so and there's also a few dikes that erupted over by Prineville. This is basically beginning at 17 million years and going through about 14 million years ago. What we have here is the little triangles are calderas that erupted. So the calderas are basically where the upcoming basalts melted the crust and created these huge explosive eruptions. Those include not only the McDermott caldera, but the High Rock caldera and a number of other calderas in Nevada that are related again to the Yellowstone hotspot. We're also going to see that there's a trend of Yellowstone hotspot related magmas that move off towards Newberry. Those include Wagon Tire Peak and a number of others. Okay, so what's going on here? Why did these lavas why did the hotspot material move so far and move so far afield from the place where it actually seemed to surface, which was in southeast Oregon and portions of the high desert? Well, if you think about what's going on here, North America is a continent that has really deep roots. And at about 17 million years, when this hotspot is now beneath the westernmost edge of the continent, it's actually being squeezed by North America's motion. And so one idea is that this material is being sort of compressed, squeezed, and forced, kind of like you would push on a tube of toothpaste or maybe a balloon that would squeeze this material up towards the surface in many different directions. And you'll notice on this diagram, there's a lot of cracks in the rocks that it's coming up through. These are accreted terrains. They are very fractured. They have lots and lots of faults. They have lots of folds. They can be more easily deformed. And so when the hotspot is being pressured, literally pressured by North America, it's basically trying to find a number of ways to the surface, and it's also found its way through the old Farallon plate so that it can actually finally send a lot of magma towards the surface. Hence, the Columbia River basalts are brought to you by the Yellowstone hotspot. So these are Columbia River basalts at Joseph Creek in Northeast Oregon. I talked a lot about dikes. This is a Columbia River basalt dike near Brownlee, Oregon, just kind of verging on the high desert. But you can see that the basalt columns here are horizontal. And that's because this dike is very, very narrow, and basalt columns grow from the cooling surfaces. So here, the cooling surface has been eroded, but you can see these stacked columns, which grew from the left towards the center and the right towards the center. And so you have something that looks like a big log pile made out of rocks. But that's characteristic of a dike, of a conduit that goes, deep down into the crust. And this eventually would have erupted lava far, far above it. When you go to Steens Mountain, you can see not only the basalt flows, there are about 75 major basalt flows and a lot of smaller basalt flows in Steens Mountain. So you can see these dikes that are bringing lava up to erupt. So this dike probably erupted this lava flow. I'm not sure what this one did. Maybe it erupted this lava flow in here. This is a more persistent dike. It may have erupted lava flows that are somewhere on the top. And over here, you can see another conduit of lava, a dike going way up to the top that erupted lavas that have been long since eroded. Not sure why I had that there, but oh, I know why I had that there. It's because we're going to go to McDermott next. Okay, the McDermott caldera. Steens basalts erupted beginning at about 17.1 million years ago and lasted until about 16.5 million years ago. The McDermott caldera erupted right at the end of that time period. So it basically is an eruptive center where you can find basalts that are similar to the Steens basalts, not exactly the same. They're a little more silica rich. But the McDermott caldera, which is about the size of Yellowstone and is now rated as one of the best sources of lithium in the world, unfortunately, erupted really explosively. And therefore, when we see the McDermott caldera today, this is McDermott Creek, home of the Lahontan cutthroat trout. This is Disaster Peak over here, which is a little older than other rocks. But here you can see the Steens basalts that are around the rim of the McDermott caldera. But when you go to McDermott or think about McDermott, rather than thinking of McDermott as this sort of lush desert environment, it probably looked a lot more like this. This is Yellowstone, obviously, with lots of hot water, geysers. This is how that lithium deposit developed from the heat from magma, the ash that fell back into this caldera and was eroded back into it. It's kind of a complicated story. I'm not going to go over this now, but the lithium was concentrated in ash-rich caldera sediments. I'd love to come back to this slide if anyone wants to learn more about how lithium deposits are created, or you can pull this up and read the material. But this is from a paper by Catherine Watts published just late last year in November. Okay, the Strawberry Volcanics, another product of the Yellowstone hotspot. We used to think that the Strawberry Volcanics were some kind of a weird cascade type volcano. They're mostly andesites, and then if you go south of the Strawberry Mountains into the high desert around Druzy and beyond, you'll find the Strawberry Volcanics there too, and there they're mostly rhyolites and basalts. So once again, they suddenly become caldera type eruptions. But the Strawberry Volcanics again have a very distinctive Yellowstone trace element composition and isotopic composition. There are about 2,000 feet of dacites, andesites, and a few basalts. And here's one piece of rock that came from rabbit ears. And you can see that there's light-colored magma or light-colored rhyolite in here, and it contains blobs of basalt. This is essentially blobs of what are the compositional equivalent of Grand Ronde basalt and Columbia River basalt. So this melt basically included parts of the material that was melting it. Another rock, another tuff from the high desert is known as the Dinner Creek Tuff. This is basically found from uh, south of Druzy and south of Unity, and basically all the way down to Burns. It's one of the most widespread volcanic eruptions in eastern Oregon. It's 16.1 to 15.7 million years old. It was erupted from the Castle Rock and Iron Mountain calderas. Again, a very, very explosive eruption. You find these tuffs as welded tuffs all the way up to where I live, halfway Oregon, in Richland, Oregon. And it basically erupted from above what's been geophysically determined to have been a magma chamber for the eruption of uh, Columbia River basalts, mostly Grand Ronde basalts. So again, these two, the Columbia River basalts and these uh, rhyolites are very closely related. So here's a welded tuff erupted from an unknown caldera somewhere in the vicinity of diamond craters. These may look like normal size columns, and they are, this is columnar jointing, but if you look down here at this is a gate in the far bottom left of this slide, you'll see that this bent gate, which is about 5 feet high, would suggest that these are truly gigantic columnar joints. Here's some little bits of yellow rabbit brush up here at the top. This was a huge eruption of the Divine Tuff, about 9.2 million years in age, probably driven by Yellowstone hotspot related plume heat and a part of the plume that was left over and was still deriving heat from its mantle source. So the Divine Tuff, if you drive down to French Glen on, I believe it's Highway 230, I think, from the vicinity of Burns, you'll see lots and lots of what appear to be basalt columns. Most of those are not basalt columns. Most of those are Divine Tuff columns, because there were many eruptions of the Divine Tuff, multiple eruptions of it. It went in all directions. You can find the Divine Tuff near John Day, north of John Day. So these are, again, huge eruptions. More of the Divine Tuff near Diamond, Oregon, where it is even better welded. So this is not basalt. This is tuff. And if you look at it in detail, this is basically from a road cut just to the west of Burns. You'll find that it's very glassy in places where it's retained its heat, and these dark bands in here were once rounded balls of pumice. Now they're glass. And so what happened is that as this explosive eruption happened, these balls of pumice that are going along in this inflated, fluffy, extraordinarily hot material, when that material comes to rest, the weight of it squashes these pumice balls down into these kind of discs. And so the Italians have a name for this. They call them fiamme, or flame structures. So you can kind of pretend that these are sort of flames. And this kind of a rock is called an ignimbrite. Geologists like to use terms that are Latin or Greek or some foreign language, so people think that we know a lot more than anyone else does about these rocks. But if we translated the Latin of ignimbrite, it's fiery cloud, ignis and nimbus. So it's a fiery cloud of ash that comes out of these calderas travels long, long distances, covers most of the high desert. And then we have the Owyhees. Okay, so this is Lambert Dome, and we were introduced to this area by looking at Bridie's Castle, actually, which is the same kind of material. So we have tuffs, and in some cases there were streams that ran through these tuffs, so you can find pebbles in some of these tuffs. But then we have basalts up at the top, so it's kind of a chocolate and vanilla cake of high silica, high iron, high silica, high iron, high silica. But the all of the Owyahees are part of Yellowstone hotspot eruptions. So there are a number of calderas in the Owyahees. The largest one is the Rooster Comb caldera. It's actually the Mahogany Mountain caldera, which formed most of the rocks in Leslie Gulch. It's part of the Rooster Comb caldera. These erupted from 16.1 to 15 million years ago. They created this kind of a landscape, so you can see lots of tuffs. You can also see a nice little fault running through here. Um, Here are some of the dikes that fed these eruptions. This is actually a rhyolite dike in Leslie Gulch. It actually is a post-eruption dike, but again, it gives itself away as a dike because look at these horizontal columnar joints. This is a basalt dike along Lake Owyhee, again, part of the Rooster Comb caldera. Um, Not so much in the way of columnar joints, but a lot of escaped gas and a lot of heat. And that's why the edges of these and the tuff that this has gone through are red. It's been oxidized. And this is the white material here is the chilled margin of this basalt dike. And once you get up here to the top here, you can actually see some of the um, columnar joints. So here's a map for the curious of the Rooster Comb caldera. It's essentially a Yellowstone-sized caldera. It's composed and includes two other calderas, the Three Fingers and Mahogany Mountain. Here's Leslie Gulch. Here's Rooster Comb. So when you go to Leslie Gulch, again, you're just going to Yellowstone. So I want to just mention one of the ideas about the high desert volcanics, particular what's called by geologists the high lava plains, and their potential relation to Newberry and certainly to other volcanic rocks across what's obviously the high desert. So the question is Newberry related to the Yellowstone hotspot? Well, probably not directly, but this is a highly banded obsidian at Newberry. And so I just want to point out, I'll just use maps to talk about this. So we have Newberry right here. And then notice that the here's that as we go to the west, the volcanic rocks get younger. So here's the 10 million year old, 8 million year old, 6 million year old, 4 million year old, 2 million year old, and finally Newberry in the high desert field. And notice that these rocks get younger going to the west, whereas Yellowstone gets younger going to the east. And a lot of geologists have puzzled about this for a long time. And we know that that McDermott and Steens were the place where really the Yellowstone hotspot made its first big home. And then the lavas got squeezed and kind of forced up into the Lake Owyhee volcanic field and then into the Chief Joseph Dike Swarm. But did they get forced somewhere else? That's that's a question that requires some amount of thought. Certainly, there are several geologists, Gail Mayhood for one, who think that possibly this might be that certainly the rocks that are the eruptive centers that are to the west of Steens Mountain, which is down in here, down where the 50-kilometer scale is and below that, might be related, particularly based again on some geochemistry. So here's Duck Butte, about 10.5 million years old. Um, Basically, if we're looking at Wagon Tire Mountain, that falls into the field of suspicions for some contribution by Yellowstone hotspot. So does Horse Butte. So does Glass Buttes. And then after that, we really kind of lose the Yellowstone hotspot signatures. But at any rate, there's a possibility that Yellowstone may very well have been either squeezed, or another idea is that the Yellowstone hotspot, as it really got into its heyday, erupting Columbia River basalts and being squeezed by the continent's deep roots, may very well have helped to open the basin and range, as well as produced some lavas that are related, not necessarily entirely Yellowstone, but related to Yellowstone. So there we have the whole Yellowstone hotspot scenario. And I'll just run through this really quickly for you again, kind of do it as a movie. You can see that everything keeps going, seems to go to the east as North America is moving to the west. Today, Yellowstone is ensconced beneath Wyoming, but it's left a whole lot of its eruptive products back here for us to marvel at. So when you look at when you're in the Owyhees, you can think of this kind of a landscape. When you go to Smith Rock, you can think of this kind of a landscape. Strawberry Mountains, you can think of this kind of a landscape. At any rate, thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to think about answering some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ellen. Yes, we have lots of questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A
Uh-oh.
box. Yeah, you can stop sharing your screen. Um, we have, let's see, so we have some questions wondering if the land moved or the hotspot moved. So can you go over the hotspot salute again?
Sure. Yeah, the hotspot salute basically is it's the continent that's moving. So if you go back to what we were talking about with Hawaii, okay, Hawaii um, is basically the Hawaiian volcanoes get older as they go to the west. So basically, that's because the hotspot erupts basically here, and then that gets carried further to the west. It erupts again here. That gets carried further to the west. It erupts again here. And then I run out of finger space. So basically, it's the continent that's moving over the hotspot.
Great, thanks. We have a handful of definition questions. So I'll
Okay.
start with what's the difference between rhyolite and tuff? And then what does tuff mean?
Okay, great. Um, so rhyolite is the Greek word, comes from the Greek word rheos, meaning flow. So you get rhyolite is a silica-rich volcanic rock, and it has the viscosity of toothpaste. Okay, cold toothpaste at that. It tends to move really slowly. So if you think about like the eruption of Mount St. Helens, what happened one of the things that happened in that eruption is not only did the whole side of the mountain slide off, but that vent had been plugged for a long time by the fact that as this material moves up, the rhyolite moves really slowly and it freezes in the vent. And it basically, then what happens is it gets all blown apart. And as the magma erupts, it's carrying little pieces of rhyolite, little tiny itty bitty slices of the hot magma. And so if you want a demonstration of that, you can just take go buy yourself a bottle of Sprite, take the top off of it, put your finger over it, shake it for a little bit, and then take your finger off, and you will get a nice big eruption of bubbles, okay, and material that's being fragmented as it's erupting into the air. And so rhyolite refers to a composition. Tough means that rhyolitic material has gone through the process of being blown into the air and fragmented into little tiny itty bitty pieces that chill so quickly that they actually become glass. That's why flying an airplane through tough or breathing ash that's falling is not a good idea because you're inhaling glass. Bad idea. So at any rate,
Yeah.
tough is fine, fine particles, usually of rhyolite that's been blown into the air as a liquid, solidified, and then fallen down as little tiny pieces of volcanic rock.
Okay. Thank you. I can picture that spray can exploding.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I have a question about Steens. So, isn't Steens a fault block mountain? And is that from
Yes.
faulting uplift after the formative volcanic activity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, Steens is indeed a fault block basin and range mountain, one of the northernmost basin and range mountains. Um, and once upon a time, Steens was not, that far up in the air. It wasn't a mile high. It was more down where other basalts are. And
Mhm.
so basically, yeah, the Alvord Fault has sort of cut right through the middle of what many people think of was a major volcanic center, with lots and lots of dikes erupting lava flows, not from a central cone, but from, extensive, like 10-mile or 20-mile long fissures or cracks in the ground. So if you've ever watched a Hawaiian eruption, you'll notice that Hawaiian eruptions, some of them come out of central vents, but many of them come out of elongate fractures. Same with eruptions in Iceland. But yeah, Steens was probably once a huge, huge, huge volcanic edifice, and it just got cut in half by the Alvord Fault. Good question.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. We're over time, but I'm going to keep going because we still have over 400 people with us. Is that okay with you, Ellen?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. A few more questions. Um, let's see. So we have another question. Do we know why hotspots remain stationary or why they exist at all?
That is a wonderful question. We th- it would seem that the idea right now is that there's some kind of a perturbation at the core mantle boundary that develops an area within the mantle that is stationary because it's being almost driven by the core mantle boundary issue, whatever that may be. Um, and so it tends to be stationary. The more we study hotspots, the more we realize that they move, but they don't move very far. They move a few miles here and a few miles there, maybe 10 miles, but it's the plate going across them that produces this chain of volcanoes.
Okay. And then related, so is the plate still moving? And so could one day the hot spot be under Chicago?
Right. It would, yeah, the hot spot basically, I'm not sure about Chicago, but yeah, one day it could be under somewhere else, maybe St. Louis.
Hmm.
Yeah. It would maybe surface in one of like the hot spot in the first slide.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah,
Okay. Thank you.
that's a great question. No, the plate's still moving, the hot spot is still active. There's some controversy over uh, whether Yellowstone is sort of, whether it's thinking about erupting again. It's had a periodicity of about 600,000 years, kind of like our earthquakes have a periodicity of between 400 and 300 years. So, there's sometimes there's a cycle to these things.
Okay. Another question. So, is the Earth's crust different in different places? Someone is wondering why rhyolites look different across the country, across the globe.
Okay. No, that's a great question. Um, the Earth's crust is is not uniform everywhere. So um, the Earth's crust basically has formed from, over 4.5 billion years by starting with small amounts of rock that essentially was slightly more buoyant than the rest of the mantle or the crust. So that kind of came up to the surface. And then you ultimately had the beginning of plate tectonics with plates crashing into one another, and they managed to scoop up other stuff and wedge it onto things. So, for example, the but by and large, let me just say that by and large, the crust is lighter in weight and density than the mantle is. That's why we're up here and the seafloor is down there. And it's also not uniform in age or in composition, but it's generally um, has more silica in it than the mantle does. So the um, here on the west coast of North America, we have a whole bunch of what are called accreted terrains, which are volcanic islands and oceanic plateaus and other things that North America has run into over the last 120 million years. If we go to so that's, crust that is maybe almost more like an ocean floor crust than it is the older continental crust. So
Mhm.
crust basically isn't exactly the same everywhere, but it's lighter than the mantle.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Um, we have so many good questions. I'm just going to ask one more. So, where does the water come from when geysers are and craters are being formed? And then once the plate moves from the hot spot, does it evaporate? And then does that leave behind what we see today in Oregon's high desert?
Hmm. Well, I don't think we see a lot of the result of water in the high desert today because that water has all gone away. Water is from geysers is water that's been on the surface and then it settles into the um, a little deeper into the crust to where it's warmer through cracks and faults and other mechanisms that allow the water to seep down. And so then the geyser erupts and the water comes out, and then it sits there for a while, and then it finds more cracks to go back into the earth. So um, it's mostly a superficial process, But water is also really important in making rhyolite magmas erupt. And in some cases, a lot of that does come from meteoric or surface water that seeps down into a magma chamber. But some of it is simply water that it comes from other sources that's deeper. And
Okay.
so in order for a rhyolite to actually move, it actually has to have water in it. The rhyolite,
Hmm.
well, it
Hmm.
makes it move more quickly, but it also sometimes makes it explode, as per the
Okay.
Sprite bottle.
Yeah. Back to that. Thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
can we do one more?
yeah, you want to do one more?
Yeah, let's do one more.
Okay. There are so many good ones. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, everyone who's still with us. We still have so many people. Um, Let me see. Um, Someone is asking, uh, for people who want to explore volcanic geology of Eastern Oregon on their own, what are a few must-see spots in Eastern Oregon and what should they look for?
That's a great question. Yeah, thank you. Um, well, I think Smith Rock is a wonderful place to begin because you get to walk into the sort of the eruptive um, center of the Crooked River caldera, and it's a state park and it's easy to get to, and you can watch lots of people climbing up those nice welded tufts. You can see dikes cutting through it. The rhyolite dikes are very red in color and a very different composition than the tufts that people climb. Um, I think Leslie Gulch is another relatively easily accessible place. Um, Strawberry Mountains are interesting because they're not really rhyolite, they're andesite and dacite. So these rocks have a little more iron in them, and they were a little more intimately connected the um, with the Grand Ronde basalt magma chamber. And so they mixed with basalt more before they erupted. Um, so a hike into Little Strawberry Lake that's probably a 4 mile walk, 3 mile walk from the parking lot at um, south of uh, Prairie City. Let's see. So those are three spots that I think, if you wanted to go look at the rhyolites, those are good places to go. I think also, any place that you look at, Picture Gorge is a great place to look at the basalts and also the soils that developed in between basalts. And those soils, basalts are interesting because they contain a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide. And so when the Columbia River basalts erupted, they they've put so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we actually warmed up the planet by a couple of degrees centigrade for
Wow.
about 500,000 years. So that's known as the mid-Miocene climactic optimum. So basalts are definitely one of the major climate change mechanisms. We've seen when the basalts, uh, the worst um, extinction event known in the Earth's history came at 252 million years ago when a huge amount of basalt erupted in what's today Siberia, the Siberian traps. So we saw huge excursions in not only atmospheric chemistry and ocean chemistry, but also in how hot the planet got. So there's quite the story in the relationship of basalts and climate change. We're kind of being our very own major basalt eruptive episode.
Oh no.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're putting lots of carbon
Yeah,
dioxide into the atmosphere. We
warming
used
it
to be
up.
putting a lot of sulfur and other toxic things into the atmosphere that not so much anymore. But anyway, that's so yeah, I think Strawberry Mountains, the Owyhees, um, Smith Rock, if you want to see, really have a chance to look at these more rhyolitic rocks, those are good places to go.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
Um, Thank you to everyone who submitted great questions. I know
Yeah.
there's some questions about the lithium, and we're going to send out this full recording in an email tomorrow. And so I encourage you to go back to that slide and pause on it and check it out.
Mhm.
Um, and also, just Dr. Bishop, thank you so much. The whole chat is just overflowing with how fascinating your talk was and how informative and engaging. Like it's overwhelming in the best way. So just thank you so much. Thank you
Okay.
for presenting tonight and sharing your knowledge with us.
Yeah.
And thank you to everyone who's here. Thank you for staying late and thank you for being a part of the ONDA community. We really appreciate it and encourage you to donate to support high desert conservation. And with that, thank you again, and everyone have a wonderful night.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Mhm.